Hey, I got something really exciting to share with you today. Now, pretty much every time I teach a workshop, I have people ask me about the shoes that I wear, which are called Sokwa, by the way. So I train in these shoes, I teach in these shoes, I've explored in these shoes for around about 4 years now. And if you train Tai Chi Chuan, you'll know it's pretty difficult to find a good shoe to train in because you need something that's durable, that's going to last, but also something that provides maximum connection to the floor. And that's why I use these shoes called Sokwa. So they use this plastic micro thin 1.2 millimeter thick sole that outperforms rubber. And I know this from experience. The ones that I've got now, I've had for about 2 years. The sole is still in great condition. They use neoprene sides that insulate the foot in hot or cold weather. And what really seals the deal for me is that they almost feel like you're not wearing anything on your feet. I mean, it just feels like a sock with a sole. So they're super, super comfortable. It's like walking barefoot, basically. So like I say, I've taught in these shoes, I've run through jungles in these shoes, I've spied on the beach in these shoes. You can even swim in these things, and you can just throw them in the washing machine whenever you like to get them clean. They're really, really cool. And they're way better than the traditional cotton slippers that most people use for Tai Chi, which just disintegrate after any kind of length of time. So what is cool is I've spoken to David, the CEO of Sokwa, and he is offering listeners of this podcast, and basically anybody who visits my site, warriorstrategy.com, he's offering you guys 20%, okay? That's 20% discount on anything you buy through their store if you click through the ad on my website, which is in the sidebar. So if you want to make use of this 20% discount, you just go to warriorstrategy.com. Have a look in the sidebar for the green Sokwa ad. It's like 2 or 3 rows down in the sidebar. Just click on that Sokwa ad. It will take you through to the Sokwa site, and you're going to get the promotional code which will give you that discount. These shoes are super cool. I'm telling you about them because I've been using them for years and I think they're really cool. So enjoy the discount, guys. Hello there, this is Robin Gamble. Welcome to the Scholar Warrior podcast. Now, the idea of the Scholar Warrior has been around for thousands of years across many great cultures. And the concept is this, that one of the highest achievements in society is to become skilled in the martial arts while also pursuing the scholarly pursuits of painting, poetry, music, philosophy, and more. So it's here that I interview martial artists as well as artists in various fields so that you, the listener, can gain a peek into their techniques, skills, and strategies for success. And so that you, the listener, may gather these gems and apply them on your own path to self-mastery and excellence. Enjoy. So my guest today is Stanley Tam. He was born in Hong Kong, and Stan is now a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under Tony Eduardo Lima. He's been training in the martial arts since the age of 13, specializing in the Chinese martial arts until he found his true calling in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He travels regularly to train with the best BJJ teachers in the world and has competed internationally, medaling in tournaments such as the International Masters in Brazil and the Asian Open in Japan. Stan is a much sought after teacher with an interest in developing a conceptual approach to Jiu-Jitsu and also in training military and law enforcement. Stan is officially appointed as the Jiu-Jitsu and Combatives Instructor for the, I'm going to try and say this correctly, Zhejiang Police Academy, Shanghai SWAT team, and to an elite counter-terrorism unit in the People's Armed Police in Shanghai. He's certified in Modern Army Combatives and is certified as a Level 2 Advanced Kettlebell Instructor under the world-renowned Steve Maxwell. His other interests include development as a holistic health practitioner and as a naturopath, and he's clearly a man of many talents. So we welcome Stan to the Scholar Warrior podcast. Welcome, Stan.
Thanks for having me, Robin.
Pleasure. Very, very excited about some of the topics we're going to jump into today. I know you were on a podcast recently with the Jungle Brothers, and I would suggest anybody that's listening also check that out, because there's a lot of interesting information and takeaways from that interview. So we're going to look at Stan's background to begin with. And so you started martial arts at 13, and you mentioned, I think I heard that this was partly for self-defense originally. So could you paint the picture of what was going on at that time?
Yeah, since a kid, I've always been interested in the martial arts. It's probably because back in the 80s, when my family immigrated to Australia, we were like one of the very, very few Asians in like a small Australian town. And I remember seeing like Bruce Lee VHS tapes. We went to the video shop and I thought, man, that's really cool. I need to watch this. And after I watched it, like with any kid, you just like fall in love with the martial arts. So I've been like interested in martial arts since I was a kid. And I dabbled in a little bit of martial arts when I was 8 years old in Australia. But my training really started at 13. It was just something that I've always been really passionate about.
So what did you start with when you were 13?
When I was 13, I had a year of schooling in Taipei. And in Taipei, I went to Taipei American School. They had like a place called TYPA, which is kind of like a YMCA. And I just walked into a class. It was called Full Contact. It's kind of like kickboxing. So at the same time, because...
Is that Sanshou or Sanda?
Not really. It's kind of like a stuff, kickboxing. I think it's just some full contact style that the teacher had. But at the same time, because since I was young, I was thirsty for knowledge. And I was walking around the parks in Taipei looking for a teacher. And near the park where I lived, I found this really cool Tai Chi teacher. And I also started training that. So that was kind of my foray into martial arts in general. And that's how I started with a lot of the internal martial arts that I started doing that since.
So what was interesting about the Tai Chi teacher? You were walking along, lots of Tai Chi in Taipei, I presume. But what was it that caught your eye about this guy?
I think it was kind of a bit of luck that I came across such a high-level guy. In the West, Tai Chi, it's more of like a yoga thing, kind of like a mind-body exercise. But in China, traditionally, it's a martial art. Okay, I must say it might not be the most combat effective martial art, but nevertheless, it's counted in as a martial art. So with that thought in mind, when I saw some Tai Chi, my thought was, okay, this is a martial art. I have to go check it out. And I saw the teacher there, and that was a long time ago. From my memory, I remembered him like inviting me over, talking to me, and then he had me push him. And I was 13 years old at the moment, and I was a kid, but when he let me push him, I just could not push him. He was standing on one leg and let me push him, and I couldn't push him. So the next day, I brought my brother back. Because obviously I went home all excited, and I told my brother I brought him back. And the two of us waited until he finished class, and I wanted to have a go. And two of us couldn't push him. And then he would let me grab his arm lock him, bend his wrist, and it just didn't work. And that was kind of my introduction to the internal arts. And I thought, man, this is really cool. And yeah, that memory has been with me ever since.
Okay, I see. I also, from listening to your interview before, heard that a certain master made you practice a single technique for a year before teaching you anything else. So could you tell us, the logic behind that, by getting you to practice a single technique for a year, and did you benefit from that process?
Actually, I did a single technique for a year. I had the easy way out because traditionally it's 3 years. So I came to Shanghai probably around 17 years ago to pursue like Chinese internal martial arts. And through introduction, I got a introduction to learn to internal martial arts from a Wudang Dragon Gate lineage holder. I was practicing a style called Xingyi, which is based on the 5 elements and the 12 animals. And so I would go to the park. It wasn't a school. It's like traditional masters. They teach in the park in the mornings. And I would teach, I would learn from my teacher like one technique. And that one technique was kind of like the basics. It's kind of like the jab in the boxing.
Was it
Or,
P-Tren?
yeah, P-Tren, yeah. So yeah. Yeah, so I did the P-Tren, basically just one basic technique for 1 year. I would go to the park every morning, wake up at 5, whether it's snowing, freezing cold, or super hot. I would just go there and do one technique, and the teacher would just watch you, and then he would chat to his friends on the side, and you'd still be training that. So I did that technique for a year before I was allowed to learn a second and a third technique. That's the traditional way in China. The reason is that apparently teachers want to test whether you are sincere. They don't want to teach anybody that rocks up. They want to make sure that you have the character to endure the hard training that follows, and also to check out whether you're a good person or not. Because traditionally in China, they tend to be very stingy with knowledge, and they withhold a lot of things, and they only teach their sons or their very, very close disciples. So the teacher would take 1, 2, or 3 years to see, whether you are like the right person for him to teach, whether he likes you, whether like you have a bad character, you're a criminal or immoral. So it's like a testing time. But also like, it's good and a bad, because if you do that, if you can endure for that long, you actually do develop a good foundation. But from a Western approach, you would think, maybe that time you could systematically learn a few more things that could improve your knowledge as well. So it's kind of like a pros and cons.
So obviously, I'm a little bit familiar with that process of teachers testing you to see if they're going to teach you. So the screening process is like a screening process, and I suppose you're also building a foundation at the same time. Do you think a screening process is necessary in the martial arts, or do you think there's other ways that you can screen who you'd like to teach?
Actually, with my experience in China and with teaching a lot, I actually kind of more and more believe in some type of screening process, because for me, having a good character is the most important. I mean, like, I don't mean that like people come to your school and they become criminals, etc. But because it's kind of heartbreaking when you like give a lot to people and people don't appreciate it, and then they turn around and then they leave and they do something else. So in order to like kind of protect yourself emotionally as well, and making sure the right people get your attention, I think it's good to have some kind of screening process, because you want to avoid a situation where you are giving a lot of attention to some person that's not going to appreciate it and just walk away. And then the people actually deserve your attention. They don't get like, all the things that you could be teaching them.
So have you found, so obviously, in retrospect, having taught a lot of people, you kind of now see, you've been through the process and you see the logic of the processes as well. How can you do that when you're running a big school or something?
Actually, with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because of the way the belt systems work and how difficult it is to progress in belts in Jiu-Jitsu, it's actually a natural screening process, which is a bit different from Chinese martial arts. Because in Chinese martial arts, you could actually learn a lot of things, a lot of forms quite quickly. But in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, to develop the timing and the skill, even for a white to a blue belt, it takes an average around 2 years. And from white to black, it's an average of 10 years. So by the time someone gets to a blue belt, you've actually had 2 years of like, you can call it screening time or teaching or time with the student. So you can actually see what kind of person he or she is. And when a jiu-jitsu person gets to a purple belt, which is another 3 years, so altogether 5 years, that's, a good enough amount of time to see what that person is like.
Right, and it's important to point out that in a lot of other belted systems, let's say it's it's not as difficult to achieve the belts, right? I mean, uh, for example, for someone to get a blue belt, it means that they've done a lot of hard sparring for 2 years, correct?
Yeah, I mean, the martial arts in general, because of the maybe of commercialization, it's been watered down a lot. Uh, Everybody kind of knows that in general, like in Taekwondo, I'm not sure about in the West. In China now, Taekwondo, you could get a black belt in 1 year. But I heard from the old timers that back in the day in Korea, it also takes 10 years to get a black belt in Taekwondo. But now it seems like every kid, 13, 14 years old, they have some type of black belt in a martial art. With Jiu-Jitsu, unfortunately, it seems to be heading that way. But at least in my school, we try to keep it kind of old school. Because of the time it takes, by the time someone gets a purple belt in Jiu-Jitsu, is actually equivalent of a black belt in a lot of other martial arts.
Right, I see. So, just popping back to the background. So, at a certain point, there seemed to be, if I'm right, a little bit of a loss of faith in the Chinese fighting arts at a certain point, and then then the transition to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So, was there any specific events that kind of led to that?
Yeah, I did a lot of martial arts as a kid, but I gravitated towards the Chinese martial arts, specifically the internal styles. I'm not sure if your listeners will be familiar. It's basically the Xingyi 5-element 12 animal style, and the Bagua, and also Tai Chi. I did quite a bit of Tai Chi as well.
Yeah, maybe you could. Sorry, could you explain the difference to listeners between external and internal martial arts? That might be quite useful if people are confused by this terminology.
Yeah, so in general, external martial arts would be what people refer to as like the hard style karate, like the Koshinkai, a lot of the Shaolin styles, which from the beginning they use, if not sure of the right word to use, more power and kind of like more strength and athletic attributes in the training. The internal martial arts takes the opposite spectrum. So a lot of the training begins with being calm and relaxed and being focused on being mindful. Ultimately, they all lead to the same path, but it starts from a different beginning. So if you do Tai Chi, you learn your Tai Chi form, which is very soft and flowing, as opposed to like a hard style karate form where they use, quite a lot of force.
Okay, so sorry to send you off course there. You're talking about maybe some specific events that led to you transitioning from martial arts from the Chinese fighting perspective and over to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So, yeah, what events led to that?
Yeah, I was doing a lot of Chinese martial arts, probably because of a little bit of patriotism as a kid, Chinese kid growing up in Australia. I thought, hey, I'm ethnically Chinese, so let's do Chinese martial arts. And those were the styles that I found and I started to practice. I've actually always wanted to learn Jiu-Jitsu because I saw an ad in the Black Belt magazines in the 90s about Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. But back then, you can't learn it anywhere, right, outside of Brazil. And maybe like in small populations within the US. So I could learn it. So I was doing the Chinese martial arts for quite a number of years. I kind of knew that there were more combat effective ways, but kind of being stuck then, that's like pre-UFC days, you weren't really sure. So the Chinese martial arts led me to come to China to pursue it full time. But then at that time as well, I saw an ad in a expatriate magazine about this mixed martial arts group, and they had jiu-jitsu. So I thought, wow, I've always wanted to do this, so I'm going to check it out. So I started training there as well, alongside with the Chinese martial arts. The first instructor there was actually a British man by the name of Matt. He was at the time actively fighting in Shuto in Japan, which is a mixed martial arts organization. So when he was in China, he had nobody to help him train. So I was helping him train. And so when we were sparring, I noticed that a lot of the Chinese martial arts just did not work very well. And very quickly, I had to resort back to the 1 year of kickboxing I did when I was in university to actually survive in sparring. So that made me question, hey, a lot of this stuff kind of, I couldn't put it into practical use. And then, so I just started doing more and more jiu-jitsu. And then eventually, I actually stopped practicing the internal martial arts and just focused all my time on jiu-jitsu.
So it was getting the beatings from Matt was maybe a part of it.
You always find the hard way, right? At least I found out. Because I'm sure there's still a lot of people out there who are, disillusioned.
Okay.
Or delusional, I should say. That's the right word.
Delusional, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure they'll be really happy to hear that. Yeah. So the art of jiu-jitsu. So for some people listening who might not be super up to date on martial arts, maybe have missed out on the Brazilian jiu-jitsu revolution, or they may have heard of jiu-jitsu, but for example, not Brazilian jiu-jitsu or BJJ. How would you explain BJJ and how it took kind of the martial arts world by storm in the past 20 years or so?
Well, jiu-jitsu is actually a complete form of martial arts. So it has strikes, clinch, grappling, and weapons defense. So this particular style, it originated in Brazil with the Gracie family. The Gracie family, they learned it from a Japanese immigrant early last century, a Japanese man who immigrated to Brazil. And so long story short, the Japanese jiu-jitsu man taught the Gracie brothers. And the Gracie brothers, being smaller in size, they had to modify the technique so that it would work with more leverage. And Brazil is kind of like a rough place, so a lot of street fights. So they had to modify the style so it was, so it would survive in a rougher kind of country. And they eventually started doing Gracie challenges where they would invite other martial arts to challenge them. And, they always prevailed. And so it kind of grew from there. And then it didn't really hit the world stage until 1993 when the UFC started, when they had Royce Gracie defeat several opponents from different martial arts in one night. And then the world kind of knew what jiu-jitsu was after that.
Right. And so you are now a black belt in BJJ, which is a monster of achievement. And you alluded to it a little bit, but could you describe a little bit more about the journey from white belt to black belt and, what it entails to listeners? I mean, how much, you've competed on an international level and obviously you're sparring many times a week. Is it still, for example, a requirement that to achieve a black belt or for that matter, any other belt, that you have to compete? Like you have to compete, otherwise you can't achieve a grading?
No, actually, you don't have to compete. Competition is only a certain percentage of the whole art. So going back to your original question, the journey from starting jiu-jitsu in Shanghai is kind of unique because back then when I first started, which was around 13 years ago, there was nothing, So it was a few of us renting a space in a kung fu school and throwing some mats down several times a week to train. In the beginning, we didn't have a black belt teacher. We had our shooter friend who we mentioned before. He was a purple belt at the time. He was teaching us. He did a great job, showed us all the basics. But back then, there was no structure to the class or the training. It was such a bunch of guys trying to beat each other up. And then back then, it was like the heyday of Pride, which is like a big mixed martial arts event from Japan. And we would watch the shows, get excited and train, beat each other up, and there'll be a lot of injuries. And then a couple of years later, I was lucky that Tony Aguado, who's from Brazil and still my current instructor, he came to live in China for 6 months. And that's when the classes start to get a little bit more structured, a little bit more formal. And then our informal mat space kind of grew from there. But jiu-jitsu was quite rare. So I had to start to teach when I was basically a blue belt because there was no one else around. And after Professor Tony left, we fly him back to China every year so that he could come teach. And I myself, I would like travel to the US, and I've been to Brazil a couple of times to learn and to train as well. And because of the way things were, I kind of veered a lot towards the teaching side. There was a stage, that's about 2-3 years where I was really into competing. I would go and compete quite a bit. But as the school kind of grew, I had to teach a lot, and I started to focus on designing the curriculums and how to structure the class, and slowly became more professional. And today we have more than 10 locations in China now.
Wow, that's impressive. Very impressive. And I heard you talk again in a previous podcast about building mat culture. So for again, for perhaps people that don't know what the mats are the place where you do the training and you get thrown and you grapple on the mats. So the mat culture is obviously how people behave when they're in your dojo. So I've got two questions about this. First of all, what does the mat culture look like in your dojo, and how might that differ from other places?
Well, first of all, let me explain what mat culture is, because not every school talks about it, although it's always there. So it's like when you go to a country, there's a vibe, there's a accepted way of doing things. That's what we would refer to as the place culture. So in a school or a dojo, they also have their own culture. So we call it the mat culture, the mat where we train. So we have set of etiquette, unspoken rules about what you can and cannot do, how you treat people. So I think that's very important. In my school, it's very important that people are polite. Senior students, they help beginners, always help each other learn. We don't like to have the tough guy mentality that you see in some schools where the more experienced guys beat up on the less experienced guys, and people walk around acting tough. That's a big no-no in my school. Everyone has to be helpful and friendly. And I think that shows that when a lot of international visitors come, they always leave feeling happy and they leave good comments about us. And what was the second question?
So how would that differ from other places? But I think you pretty much explained that.
Okay. Yeah, it's hard to generalize because in general, jiu-jitsu schools, especially the places I've been to, are quite friendly and people are quite nice. I think the good thing about jiu-jitsu is that you know where you stand and you know your abilities, so that in turn makes you very modest and humble. Because going back to my Chinese martial art days, the arts are very beautiful for me. The movements, the mobility is very nice. But because in general, traditional Chinese martial arts, they don't usually practice combative situations every day. That's why over time, I found that people tend to develop kind of like a false sense of security and a kind of a false sense about what they can or cannot do. And it kind of leans towards being exaggerated about their abilities, about being able to beat up 10 guys. And people start to believe in the old man in the mountains who's got super skills, who can, become the UFC champion. So in the Chinese martial arts, people kind of, tend towards that kind of attitude. And then there becomes like an air of superiority amongst some practitioners. But in jiu-jitsu, that's actually kind of rare because you're in the mat every day sweating. You're getting tapped, you're tapping other people, and it's no big deal, You just deal with it, and it's very down to earth. So people, tend to be quite friendly, compared to what I've experienced in the past in the Chinese martial arts world.
Right. Okay. So having, sorry, I just want to go back to the mat culture, because I think that's very interesting. Because I think if you're a leader, you really dictate the culture anywhere that you are. For example, if you're the father of the family, you set the culture for the family. If you're the leader of a business, you set the culture for the business, and what is acceptable and what isn't, and how you want it to grow. So So what are the concrete ways that you went about specifically building the culture in your dojo?
I wouldn't say there's a set formula, but the culture is always led, like as you said, by the teacher and very importantly, also the senior students. Because when new students come to your place, they always look at how the senior people behave and they kind of take in the cue of what is acceptable and what is not. And it's kind of an automatic process. They adapt to it without even knowing it. And over time, they're going to start behaving like everyone else. They kind of morph into it. So it's important that the teacher and the senior students pay attention to how they behave, to how they talk to other people, and and how they train. Because trust me, there are people watching and they take notice of it. And if you want your school to grow healthily, you must make sure that you put bad behavior in its place and stop it right there, and encourage the good behavior.
So that's something that you've eventually consciously kind of managed. So does that mean if you see some kind of behavior, you come down it quite hard, or you take someone to one side or something, or?
Generally things are good, but yeah, when new students come and they do something stupid, yeah, you tell them. Actually, usually I don't have to say it. Usually the people who's been around, like as I said, the senior students, they tell the person. So the person, if they're wise, they catch on pretty quick. Because in a jiu-jitsu school, if you don't catch on quick, you probably won't have a good time on the mats, and you probably end up leaving anyway.
Right. Okay. So a little bit of a change of topic here. Having lived in China previously, and obviously you're born in Hong Kong and you lived in China, I think it's fair to say that there can be a mild hint of anti-Japanese sentiment at times. So have you ever experienced that with teaching a Japanese art in China? Did you ever feel like a pushback or anything?
Jiu-jitsu, actually Brazilian jiu-jitsu is actually thought of as a Brazilian art in China. So there hasn't been that kind of Chinese versus Japanese thing going on within the jiu-jitsu community.
Right. So you can just totally skip that and say Brazilian.
Yeah, because people who work in the school, I think they've done their research online, so they know it's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Because my school is actually called Shanghai Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so if they go online, they would know where it's from. But it's interesting what you've said, because there actually are a lot of karate schools in China, and they seem to do well. So I'm not sure whether this Chinese-Japanese thing is a political thing, or whether it's kind of something that's deep down within the community as well. Maybe a bit of both, but it's not that apparent nowadays.
Okay, all right. And could you explain what rolling is and why it's so good?
So rolling is the term we use for sparring in jiu-jitsu, because in jiu-jitsu we tend to grapple a lot, so it looks like people rolling around the ground, and I guess that's why they call it rolling. So rolling is very important because it's a type of alive training. So alive training means that you have to incorporate timing, and you're basically sparring with an opponent who's not resisting. It's kind of not like you do this, then I do that, and you can't guess what the other person's doing 100%. So you have to rely on a lot of instincts. So it's very close to a real fighting encounter. That's why it's important. In a real fight, you obviously don't know what's going on with your opponent, right? There's no cooperation. You don't tell the person what you're going to do, and they don't tell you what they're going to do. So in jiu-jitsu rolling, it's the same. And it prepares you really well for the real world because of this factor. But the advantage is that in rolling, you can actually train sparring every day without the risk of getting seriously injured. Because unlike other alive arts of sanshou, boxing, or Muay Thai, we're not actually, doing physical damage punching each other in the face hard every day. In jiu-jitsu, if you get submitted, you can just tap and no one gets hurt and you can start training again. So we can actually train pretty hard, get a good workout, and get as close as we can get to a real encounter without the risk of serious injuries.
Right. And when you're rolling with someone and they get you in a rear naked choke or a guillotine or something, I mean, the unique thing is that you're in a position to kill someone basically. So it's it's a pretty great way of training, right? It's basically safe, but you're getting into a position of complete dominance over another person.
Yeah, exactly. So in jiu-jitsu, the techniques we use in rolling are the exact same techniques we would use in a real fight. And then we can do it pretty much close to 100%, but without hurting your training partner. So that's the huge advantage.
Right. So obviously you're in Shanghai, you're this Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and you have been working with security forces of various descriptions. So could you talk a little bit about that security work that you do, and maybe how the content you teach them differs to a regular class, or maybe any kind of stories from teaching those guys? How does that go?
Yeah, so in China, I've been teaching law enforcement and counterterrorism for a while. So I work with several elite units and also the riot police for the biggest prison system in one of the provinces here. I approach teaching them different. Of course, you would have to, teach different things to different audiences. With the police, I focus less on the sporting side, and I focus a lot more on clinch work. How to stay on your feet, and if you're on the ground, how to get back on your feet, and how to engage your opponent without hurting them. Because with a lot of the police, believe it or not, even in China, you can't really go up and kick or punch a suspect in the face. So I teach them clinch, take down, how to control a suspect on the ground, hold them, and then how to turn them around so that they can handcuff the suspect. And I do a lot of the jiu-jitsu self-defense as well. I think a lot of the Gracie self-defense is really good for anybody, police, or even civilians. I think a lot of the self-defense aspects has been neglected in the average jiu-jitsu school today. So I work a lot on that with the police as well. And yeah, I'm very happy to be teaching them. They're very keen to learn, always wanting to add new things into the arsenal. So
have you experienced some good feedback from those guys, from the stuff they've learned? Have any of them come back to you and said, I had this experience and what you taught me really paid off, or anything like that?
Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, they're really soaking it up. They actually always wanted me to co-teach, and a lot of the times I can't even fit the classes into my schedule. Yeah, I've received feedback from the people, the police, how they are able to just use the very basic controls in jiu-jitsu to control a suspect. It's amazing that how jiu-jitsu allows you to control someone with no training at all, even with a little bit of training under your belt. It's kind of like superpowers. And I think the police here really appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think the police in Britain ought to take some notes on that. If you've seen the news recently, we had some pretty unfortunate... you saw the terrorist attack in London?
Yes, very unfortunate.
Yeah, quite sad. Maybe the police can address their defensive and tactical training a little bit, prevent some of that happening in the future. So, sorry, do you have some comments on that?
Yeah, I was just saying that I think in general, with a lot of government agencies trying to implement a new program, there's a lot of red tape and bureaucracy. That's why a lot of the new ideas, it gets soaked in very slowly. In China, actually, how they're taking up to jiu-jitsu training is a surprise to a lot of people. Because I have a guy here, he's the head of the riot police, one of the prison systems. He would do a lot of training in other defensive tactics systems in America. And the police in America attending those courses would be very surprised that he actually knows some Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And they'll be like, man, you live in China. I thought you guys were, you guys were back in the Stone Age with your defensive tactics. How come you know this stuff? And yeah, I think you'd be surprised, how quickly they're taking it up here.
Right. I can imagine the guys on the ground, if they see how effective it is, they're going to want to implement it more, right? So hopefully they can feed it back up.
Yeah, for sure.
So personally, in your experience, what has been the greatest benefit that you cherish from your jiu-jitsu training?
Yeah, that's a lot. I mean, like for my jiu-jitsu, I think, I've gained a lot of confidence in myself. I've gained some great friendships and also the ability to hang in there, A lot of times when you are rolling or sparring in jiu-jitsu, especially as a smaller person, you kind of have to endure a beatdown and survive until you get the to get the opportunity to come out on top and submit your opponent. So that kind of transfers over into life quite a lot. How you have to be resilient, tough out the bad times, and the good times will always come. So
does that approach that influences your style of jiu-jitsu, I presume? Because if we're talking about when you're rolling with an average Westerner, for example,
Yep.
Are we saying that they're typically 5'10", 75 kilos or something? So are you always having to deal with a bigger guy?
Yeah, mostly because I'm 65 kilos soaking wet, so I tend to be kind of on the smaller end of the scale. Most of the people, especially Westerners, tend to be more athletic and bigger. So my style of jiu-jitsu is very simple. I rely on what we call frames, and I try to play a style that's non-attribute based, meaning that I try not to rely on speed, power, and strength, because if I do that, I'll probably lose.
Right, okay, which is interesting because that's the root of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right?
Yes, that is. But the thing is that with a lot of this sporting side of the jiu-jitsu, with all the new rules and the time limit, people started to become more of the athlete, emphasizing a lot of the physical attributes rather than the technique.
Okay, so they're getting bigger, stronger, faster.
Yeah. Okay. Of course, it always helps to be bigger and stronger, but I'm Asian. I don't have those attributes.
Okay, so let's jump into the Qigong, which is also a major part of what you're doing nowadays. So you obviously started learning Qigong for health along with your traditional Kung Fu training. So could you explain what those exercises are and what they do?
Yeah, so Qigong is actually a branch of traditional Chinese medicine. It's kind of like a body-mind exercise where you are cultivating internal energy. In the West, it's basically called vital energy. So the goal of Qigong is to improve your health. It's kind of like yoga in China. I basically started the Qigong training when I was 13 with my Chinese internal martial arts. Back when I was a kid, I always wanted to do the fighting side. And the Qigong, which was always a component of training, seemed like the necessary evil that I had to go through before I can learn the weapons and the hand fighting forms. So I started quite young learning all that, and I've kept it up. It's always been a part of my kind of personal side that I would do at home by myself, and I haven't really shown it to the public until recently. Qigong is actually quite a new term that which hasn't been used until the 1950s. Are you aware of that? It's actually quite a new term.
Right, yeah.
Yeah,
it may have been Neigong or something beforehand, or Daoyin or...
Yeah, so it was actually called Daoyin, which, as I said before, was a part of Chinese medicine. And it was only after the 1950s that the Chinese government started really pushing the term, and that's why this term is so popular now in the West as well as in China.
So, what were the types of Qigong that you trained, and how would you describe or Daoyin if you prefer, and how would you describe their characteristics and the benefits of those arts?
Yeah, I've trained in several styles. I first started training as a kid. I learned the 5 animal style, which I'm sure if you've trained, you're familiar with. It's quite popular in China. I started doing that, and then later on, when I was doing my Wudang training, I started training in Wudang Qigong, which is more consistent of slow and soft movements. For the last year and a half, I've been fortunate enough to study with a master here by the name of Professor Yan Weibing. He specializes in a system called Yijingjing, which is kind of translates as tendon change classics. And so that style is a little bit different. It uses a mixture of tension and relaxation. There are actually a lot of different styles of Qigong. That's why it's actually hard to generalize. Some styles are quite hard in nature, where they use a lot of tension. Some styles are very soft and flowing, and you've got everything in between. It's very hard to generalize, but in general, especially what you see in the West, it tends towards more of the soft, flowing Tai Chi-like movements.
Yeah. And I think the story of why you kind of dived back into the Qigong is a fascinating one, and I think perhaps one that listeners could really benefit from. I'm thinking in regards to how you were saying you felt that you were kind of perhaps getting very tired and the body was breaking down a bit. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll go back a little bit further. So I started doing this kind of stuff quite early on, as I said before. And when I found Jiu-Jitsu, there was a time when I became quite disillusioned about all that time I spent in Chinese martial arts. And inevitably, the Qigong, which was part of what I studied with my Chinese martial arts, also fell into that category. So I stopped practicing the Chinese martial arts, but the Qigong I would still do every now and then, but not as regularly as I did, because I thought, man, all this stuff, I wasted all this time, it didn't work in a fight, man, this stuff doesn't work, it's rubbish. So I started going crazy on a lot of my fighting training. I did a lot of sparring, jiu-jitsu, and I got into kettlebells. I was doing a lot of physical training to get, as strong and as fast as I can. After a while, it started to weigh on me. About probably, I would say, 3, maybe 4 years ago, I had a serious injury from a mixture of jiu-jitsu and kettlebell training. One time when I was lifting a heavy kettlebell, my wrist just popped, it just went. And obviously it was quite painful, but being an idiot and being younger then, I ignored it for a whole year, and I kept training through it. So my wrist would dislocate every now and then throughout the year, and it'd be crazy painful. But I just thought, man, it's nothing. I'll just tough it out. So eventually I went to see like a hand surgeon, and he told me that after some tests that I tore a major ligament in my wrist, kind of like the ACL for the knee, except it's for the wrist. And so my wrist wasn't being stabilized, and it would just like slip in and out when I'd be sparring. So I had 3 surgeries to get that fixed. After the surgery, I would still train like an idiot, just training hard. Actually, back in those years, it's kind of embarrassing to say now, we would kind of brag to each other how hard we train, and it's kind of like, it's almost cool to leave the mats when you almost feel like throwing up. That's how hard we kind of train. And, it just kind of wore me. And over time, I slowly started to get more tired with the teaching as well as the training. In the afternoons, I would start falling asleep. And no matter how hard I try, around 4 to 5, I would get this like kind of cloud of fatigue that would make me want to lie down. I would actually sleep on the mat. And then I'd be all groggy and I couldn't get up. And then when I do get up, I would just get all dizzy, and for no reason. I thought I was pretty healthy. I was training hard. I had a six pack. What could be wrong, right? And so after a while, I went to see some doctors, Western doctors, both here and in Australia, where my family lives. So they took a lot of blood tests and a lot of different ultrasounds, etc. And they told me I was fine. There's nothing wrong. Of course, if you know a bit of medicine, with the Western medical model, unless you're almost dying, they won't find anything wrong with you. Subclinical stuff, they can't really detect and tell you. So they told me I was fine, which I obviously wasn't. And so I was kind of desperate. The doctors tell me nothing's wrong, but obviously something is. So I started to ramp up a lot of the energy work, the Qigong training that I did when I was younger. I started doing more and more and more and more. And probably around 4 or 5 months after I started to kick up the training, I started to feel a little bit better, actually. I started to get less tired, and my mood was a little bit better. So I thought, there's actually something to this. So I started to really get into natural health, both Western natural health and also TCM, traditional Chinese medicine. And I basically just went crazy trying to follow on what I learned as a teenager with all my Qigong training. So here I am. So basically trying to balance the hard external training of Jiu-Jitsu with the recovery side of Qigong. I like to call it recharging the battery.
Right, and it's interesting that you went through a very typical path of just going extreme yang. You get to that extreme state, and there is only one place to go after being extreme yang, right? Which is some kind of breakdown of the body or something.
Yeah, I mean the ancients, they're very wise. When they say when you reach the extreme of one polarity, you switch to the other, right? So I went to the extreme of yang, and now I'm focusing a lot of the inside. What they said is true.
It means a lot more when you go through it yourself, right? I mean, it's when you can hear it multiple times, and then when you experience it yourself, you're like, oh well, maybe they did, maybe they were onto something.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, experience is the best teacher. Because a lot of times, no matter how many times somebody tells you and how much sense it makes, when you read it from a book or if you hear it from somebody, you don't really believe it until you experience it. Even right now, I've got a lot of younger jiu-jitsu students. They train like I did back in the day, going crazy. You train through injuries. I tell them, hey, my experience was this and that, and you should be, slowing down and maybe doing some recovery. They just look at me like, I'm crazy, and they just keep doing what they're doing. So a lot of times you just have to let people kind of hit the wall, and then they will really learn.
Right. And this is really interesting because just a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Nico Shipchek, who's a former UFC fighter. And
Yep.
he's on very much the same journey, in as much as he came out of his professional career and found himself with a lot of injuries, and then rekindled kind of some interest in Tai Chi Chuan and Qigong to repair his body, and now he's also training fighters, and he said he's having the same kind of experience that you've mentioned, which is he's saying, you might want to think about incorporating some Tai Chi into your movements just to keep yourself healthy and balance yourself a little bit. And he says he's getting very good results, but obviously people are a little bit slow to come around to. I was about to say new ideas, but they're pretty freaking old, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, like they say, what's old is new nowadays.
Exactly, right. So what would you, so for example, an athlete that's listening, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athlete or a MMA athlete or, whatever kind of athlete, what would you say is the concrete benefits they could get from Qigong?
Man, there's so many benefits. I mean, just energy levels. Because when you are doing strenuous exercise, whether it's a martial art, a marathon, or whatever, you're expending a lot of energy, and it's going to come back in some way. One is healthy eating, the other is sleep, but there are also other things that we can do, like qigong. It actually, speeds up your recovery. I always like to tell people, it's like when using your iPhone, you use it all day, playing on your phone, playing games, chatting to your friends. But when you go to sleep that night, you plug it into the wall and you recharge the battery. The human body is also a battery. We need to recharge it after we expend a lot of energy. So, for example, for myself, I've got designated days where I do hard rolling. And after hard rolling, I'll always come home and I do a set of moving based qigong, and I would meditate for up to 1 hour afterwards. And it's unbelievable how much better you feel afterwards. You just feel less drained. And until you try it, it's actually very hard to describe, how good it feels.
Okay, and then so I know that you were also an executive when you were a banking executive for a while as well.
Yeah, those are the horrible days. I was I was in finance for 9 years,
Right.
sitting behind a desk and looking at martial art websites when my boss wasn't looking.
Okay, so I also work with executives. So for an executive, and going on your own experience yourself, how do you think qigong could benefit them?
But in many ways, I mean, there's some style of qigong which focuses a lot on spinal mobility. And if you're sitting in front of a desk 8 to 10 hours a day, a lot of actually these office people, they actually have neck problems. They actually get like herniated discs from looking down at the computers all the time. So a lot of these kind of spinal based movement mobility qigong styles can benefit their physical health quite a bit. And with the qigong, with a lot of the breathing exercises, you will help them maintain alertness, and you would help them be more calm. When you're in an important meeting, you know how to center your breath and bring everything back to the center. You can apply all of that stuff, whether you're working hard in the office or whether in your everyday life. It all has benefits.
Okay, and for people listening, what is one qigong concept that they could take away from the podcast? Maybe is there one concept or idea that you really like? I know it's difficult when I keep pushing you to pick one thing, but if there was one thing that a listener could take away and maybe ruminate on or think about, what would you tell them?
Yeah, actually, that's a tough question because it's such a broad art and complicated but simple at the same time. What I would like to say is that I'm saying the obvious, but a lot of people don't do it. I think consistency. You have to be consistent with your practice. I know that in today's world, everyone's busy and no one has 20 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever. But you'd be surprised at how much time someone wastes on just doing rubbish, or watching a stupid TV show. Use some of that time and try to do it consistently to practice your internal exercises, even if it's just for 15 minutes a day. Look for some time out there. When you build on a consistent practice, that's when the benefits start showing itself. If you practice just, twice a week or whenever you feel like it, the results are not going to be as good as if you just keep your mind on it. So consistency and trying to find the time wastes in your day so you can further your practice.
Great advice. So I'm now going to ask you some questions specifically for listeners, and these.
Yep.
I mean, they can be long or short as you choose. So, what could Kung Fu people learn from BJJ?
A life training. I think Kung Fu is beautiful, but if you do traditional training, you probably do not do a lot of live drills or sparring. So I would say add a lot of uncooperative and a live training into your practice.
What could BJJ people learn from traditional Kung Fu people?
Actually, quite a lot. I think they should learn a lot of the traditional values, respect for the teacher, respect for your fellow classmates, and a sense of tradition and, feeling proud about your lineage. A lot of, in Chinese, what we call 武德, basically translates as martial morals. I think with a lot of the popularity of mixed martial arts nowadays, it's become more of a sport, and people miss a lot of the traditional moral values, which makes martial arts complete and beautiful.
What advice would you give to a white belt in BJJ in 1 or 2 sentences?
It's going to be hard for them to do, but the advice is to relax, stay calm, and don't be competitive. If they can relax and actually, drop the ego, I think they'll learn a lot faster and have a lot less injuries as well, because it's very common for white belts to be over competitive and they would get hurt, or they would be afraid of trying new things. So they don't try new things that they learn, and obviously the learning curve will be a lot steeper.
Which is great advice for someone learning anything, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
That's great. What piece of advice would you give for someone looking to defend themselves better?
Well, first, if you can, run as fast as you can.
Yeah, right. Be fit, right?
I mean, in a self-defense situation, there's nobody ever wins. You always lose. You either get robbed, beaten up, or you get arrested for beating someone up. And to really answer your question as well, learn a martial art which emphasizes a life training, which we've talked a lot about in this podcast. Because a life training will give you a feeling of what it's like to, I'm not sure if it's the right word, fight somebody who's resisting you, who's actually not cooperating. So I think that's very important, to learn to deal with the unknown factor that arises in a situation that's not totally in your control.
So, and when we say alive, you mean, you're talking about uncooperative partner work.
Yeah, uncooperative partner work is not like I'm to grab you here and then I'm going to hit you there. Right. A live arts, like, we would say jiu-jitsu, judo, wrestling, boxing, sanda, muay thai, these kind of arts are the arts that incorporate timing and energy, kind of alive.
Okay. Right, now I'm going to fire some bonus questions at you. These are generally, the idea is to answer them a little bit quicker than normal and with what comes out naturally. But the reality is that sometimes we get stuck up on a couple of questions, or we have to skip a question, or you want to come back to it. So if that happens, then no worries.
Okay. This is why you should get into trouble.
Okay. Well, this one's easy enough. What's your typical daily practice?
Typical daily practice, I would wake up and then I'll have a morning routine. I would do my Qigong, my meditation, and then I would go to the gym, do my jiu-jitsu, and then I'll come back and I would do more Qigong and meditation. So in a nutshell, that's what it's like.
Wow, okay. That's interesting. Lots of Qigong in there.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me something that's true that nobody else agrees with you on.
Asians are weaker and we're not as strong as people in the West.
Oh wow, yeah. Okay, that's a big one. What's your favorite movie?
Man, I don't really have a favorite movie.
Movies.
Actually, I do actually.
Okay.
Once Upon a Time in China by Jet Li. I think that's a beautiful movie of, as we talked about, traditional values in martial arts.
Okay, and that's a series. Was there 3 of those?
Yeah, the first one. The first one is really good. The ones later kind of got a bit warped.
Okay. Your biggest or weirdest fear?
Man, I don't really like snakes. I don't think many people do.
Okay. Do you like pickles?
Yeah, I don't mind pickles.
Okay. What's the biggest mistake you've made in your life, and how have you overcome it?
Actually, the biggest mistake is probably actually staying in China for as long as I have, because if you've read the news, I mean, like, it's not the healthiest environment. The pollution is quite bad, and for someone into natural health, it's not a very good environment to live, so many years in. So right now, I'm actually in the process of relocating back to Australia, where I grew up with my wife.
Okay. And we're talking about Shanghai, right? Which is, it's right up on the scale. Would it be one of the most top 5 polluted cities, or maybe top 10?
Actually, there are a lot more polluted cities, but even here, it's pretty bad. Most days, I have to wear a mask when I walk around outside.
Okay. That means the feng shui is a very bad no-no.
Yeah, this is the kind of feng shui which the ancient ancestors never foresaw.
Right, yeah. Okay, so what remains is for me to thank you, and also let people know where they can get in contact with you, where they can learn about you, how they can train with you, and all that good stuff. So how should they do that, Stan?
Yeah, so they can find me on Facebook. My Facebook is under the Tao, TAO, of Anti-Aging and Mobility. And my website is www.tamsystem, TAM, and system.com.
Okay, TAM system. Very good. Stan, thank you so much. That was a blast. And I think we learned a ton. there's a ton to get out of that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Hey guys and girls, before you go, I want to tell you about the Mindfulness for Modern Life bundle I've created for you. You can get this for free when you sign up for updates at warriorstrategy.com. Now in this bundle, you're going to get an 8 Tai Chi Trend Performance Enhancers PDF, a powerful Qigong video, and a mindfulness audio track. So what are you waiting for? Head on over to warriorstrategy.com. Hey, this is Robin Gamble, thanking you for listening, hoping you enjoyed the content, and kindly asking you to share with your friends if you did. Thanks again, and see you next time.